Hello, it's Keith Yates again. In part one of the historical documentary on the history of Korean karate in America, you saw some of the original interviews I did with some of the pioneers of martial arts in this country. That included Alan Steen, my original instructor, J. Pat Burleson, and even June Rhee. You also heard about how Mr. Rhee and the other Koreans who came to this country in the 1950s and 60s made the conscious decision to use the term Korean karate. That was because the word Taekwondo was practically unheard of outside of a small circle of instructors back in Korea. So now in part two, you're going to hear more about how Korean karate, Taekwondo, spread across the United States. Remember that this originally was part of a package, a DVD that I put together that included the Taekwondo forms the way we did them back in the 1960s. Now, if you're interested in a modern presentation of those forms, you can go to the Apple or the Android store and download my app. It's under Keith Yates Taekwondo. But for right now, let's look at more of these interviews from the original pioneers of Korean karate.
Because communication was slow or even non-existent between countries in those times, each country, in fact each village, formulated its own style of fighting art. In Japan, the samurai developed warrior arts based mostly on the sword. The peasant classes of Okinawa concentrated on empty-handed arts. In Korea, the Hwarang warriors, a group similar to the samurai, developed an unarmed fighting art over 300 years ago. Korea eventually became less warlike, and the fighting arts declined in popularity and at one point were actually outlawed and survived only by going underground and being passed along in secrecy. In 1910, Japan overran Korea and instituted martial law. Many Koreans sought better opportunities in China and even in Japan itself. There they were exposed to other fighting arts such as Chinese Kung Fu and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu or Karate. The end of World War II brought stability back to the Far East. Korea was liberated from Japanese oppression, and thousands came back home to openly practice both the traditional Korean arts as well as the other Asian systems. In 1956, a young third-degree black belt named June Rhee arrived in Texas and introduced America to the Korean martial arts. He taught a martial arts style called Tang Soo Do, or Way of the China Hand. But since no one in this country had ever heard of Tang Soo Do, or any of the other Korean martial arts for that matter, Rhee used the more well-known Japanese term, karate. Interestingly, the original translation of karate was also China Hand, but in order to be more accepted into Japanese society, the translation was changed to empty hand. The other Koreans coming into the United States in the 50s and 60s also continued to use the name karate for their schools. But meanwhile, back in Korea, the various schools decided to unite under a new name, Taekwondo, or way of kicking and punching. The actual vote to change the name came in 1955, but it would be years before most of the Koreans decided to accept that name, and in fact, some of them did not. The die had also been set in the minds of most American practitioners, and they continued to use the word karate as a generic term. In fact, many American instructors even use a combination of Japanese and Korean terminology in their classroom, a practice actually quite natural for Americans who tend to combine techniques as well as terminology. And remember, that practice was actually started by the Koreans who came to this country in the 50s and 60s. These students are training for an upcoming karate tournament. Today, tournaments are fun events for the whole family, but it was a different matter back in the early days. Competition was fierce and injuries were common. There were practically no rules, and certainly not the non-contact rules of today. These early competitors were out to prove that karate was effective, and prove it they did. Pat Burleson won the very first national karate championships ever held in the United States. The year was 1964. The martial arts magazines have called him the grandfather of American sport karate.
You know, it was really very simple why tournament competition was emphasized and stressed back in the late 50s, early 60s. I myself, when I opened a karate school back then in Fort Worth, Texas, had a lot of doubtful type potential clients walk through the door. And They had to see something that worked. So we put an emphasis on self-defense aspect of it and the competitive part. I had boxers, cowboys, street fighters, you name it, that walked through the door. And they had to see something that impressed them because they had heard of the mythology of karate, so they wanted to see some hard fact and evidence. And that's basically, in my opinion, how karate gained acceptance and gained respect in the United States, because it came over here as something that worked. Myself, I considered coming up in the first wave of black belt tournament competitors in the United States. I was grouped with people like Alan Steen, Mike Stone, and Jim Harrison. In fact, Alan Steen, Mike Stone, and Jim Harrison were known as the Bloody Three. Those guys were just terrible. They hurt everybody they fought. I was kind of the good guy. I could fight with in the same ring as those guys, but I didn't quite break the same amount of bones and everything that they did. I kind of adhered a little bit to more. I was a good guy of competition. Those were the terrible three.
Alan Steen is known as the father of Texas blood and guts karate. He was a feared competitor, winning the 1966 Internationals by beating both Joe Louis and Chuck Norris in a single evening. Mr. Steen also sponsored one of the biggest annual tournaments in the country.
We wanted to look at karate as a self-defense and not as an art form. And so competition best served our needs. And it was fun. I think tournaments are good for the martial arts. As a matter of fact, I think tournaments are what held the martial arts together in this country for the last 30 years. And the main reason tournaments are good, as far as the competition is concerned, is the fact that you get to compete with other students and kind of try out what you've learned, see what works, see what doesn't work. And it's also a goal. You train toward a tournament. So it keeps you on your toes. There's a different tournament every weekend somewhere. And without tournaments, I believe what we would have would be a school knowledge instead of a more eclectic knowledge.
I've been asked many times to compare the fighters of the early 60s, which I was a part of, with the modern day fighters, and I don't mind at all giving the modern fighters their due. A, they train harder, their techniques are more sophisticated, they can do things I never could, acrobatic things, and but it's more like boxing in that they can go round after round after round after round. I don't think the fighters of the early 60s could put the protective equipment on and go rounds with the modern fighters and do well. However, putting the modern fighters back in the arena we had with no protection, bare knuckle, and I don't think they could do well back there either. It's two different kinds of competition. It was much more rougher and barbaric back there, and there was always that element of getting hurt and getting seriously injured, and that was a big psychological factor in throwing punches and kicks. You weighed everything very carefully. You didn't just throw things like a windmill. Everything was, in some cases, you can go to the hospital, you make a wrong move. And that's a different kind of competition.
Jun Rhee not only introduced America to the Korean martial arts in 1956, but he has been active in the evolution of the martial arts in America. His invention of the foam rubber sparring pads led to the rapid development of sports martial arts. For the first time, competitors could compete in relative safety. But ironically, Grandmaster Rhee doesn't approve of the overt emphasis some schools place on the sporting aspects today. He believes that the true spirit of the martial arts lies in its philosophy rather than in just tournaments.
I don't know whether the way we are competing, like for the medals, and we are really losing some great values of martial arts, and for the respect for teachers, masters, things like that, has been losing, because as soon as they get the gold medal and trophies, they think they're better than teachers, and they start losing the respect for where they learn from. And so I really feel that in a way, motivating the children to really work hard is good. And on the other hand, we're losing the great value of traditional value of sense of respect for teachers and students. And that's one of the reasons I really personally do not really care about Olympic style.
Today's Taekwondo movement that everyone is familiar with through the Olympic exposure, I think is great for the martial arts as a whole to have the public know more about it. I particularly don't appreciate the methodology of competition they use. I think it's not a good way to compete. It isn't a very good representation of kick-punch because the emphasis is too much on the kicking. But I think overall it's good for public exposure.
Olympic Taekwondo, original Taekwondo, American Karate. The world of martial arts seems to be in a constant state of evolution. Even the training patterns or forms have changed several times since Jun Rhee came to America in the 1950s. Most of the early Taekwondo stylists learned the Tang Soo Do set of forms that were adapted from Japanese karate. In the early 70s, General Che Hong Hai devised a new set of patterns known as the Chunji forms. Most instructors at the time switched to this new set of forms, although some retained some of the older ones in their systems as well. Keith Yates was one of Alan Steen's original black belts and is president of the Southwest Taekwondo Association.
When Jun Rhee first came to this country, he taught a style known as Tang Soo Do, which was a Korean martial art that he brought over from Korea. It wasn't even called Taekwondo at that time. Now, later on, and this was before my day, they actually changed it to Taekwondo. I came up in a system under an American instructor, under Alan Steen, and we used the term karate. We called Taekwondo our style of karate, but we actually used karate as a generic term, which is why in many American schools these days you'll see karate on the window, even though their style may actually be Taekwondo or maybe Kung Fu or something like that. Now, there's been a whole Olympic movement of Taekwondo that you saw in the Olympics recently, and they use a completely different set of forms. And I think that came about because of all the political changes over in Korea. General Che was basically exiled from Korea for some of the gestures that he made to North Korea, and they actually changed the forms to the Palgays and the Taiguks, which the Olympic style uses. And the kind of forms that we do are not those at all. We still use the original forms that General Che came up with the International Taekwondo Federation. Even though we're not a member of that group, a lot of the American Taekwondo people still use those set of forms. And I've kept some of the other ones, as Mr. Steen did, Basai, Chulgi, some of those, and we'll demonstrate some of those for you. One of the things that I've tried to do is I've broadened my knowledge of the martial arts, is tried to incorporate perhaps some jiu-jitsu, some weapons techniques at the higher levels of black belt. For instance, Kobudo is the Okinawan art of weaponry, where you use the weapons that you see in the movies now, like nunchucks and sais and so forth. And we've incorporated that into our higher black belt level requirements, so that every person who's a 3rd or 4th degree black belt has to have more expansive knowledge of the martial art. In some schools, a person that's a 3rd degree black belt only knows what a 1st degree black belt knows, only he's known it longer. In our system, at least, what we try to do is emphasize a little extra stuff. You have to do forms from other martial arts. You have to do weapons. You have to do jiu-jitsu. And in fact, at the very high levels, at 5th and 6th degree black belt, I actually like people to go out and study another martial art long enough to get a black belt in another style. And several of our people have done that. I think martial arts is a lifelong study. You can't just study one art for a number of years, quit, and think you're an expert. It's something that you need to do for an entire lifetime. And there are so many different martial arts out there that you can study that you would never exhaust the possibilities.
So, many schools require more extensive training for the student that has reached 1st degree black belt. Although first black is considered an expert level by most non-martial artists, it is really only just the beginning, as Grandmaster Rhee says.
We say when you graduate from high school, it's a commencement. And that means the beginning. When you become 1st degree black belt, you are now beginning to learn martial arts. And so after that, you become more mature and your technique becomes sharper, and you understand the philosophy, not just martial art philosophy and life in general.